I remember the person who was set out to mentor me basically told me, you need to get your stuff together or you're not going to do well in this industry. And I remember at the time being like, how dare they say this to me? That's so awful. And now I'm looking back on it, I'm like, they were totally right. And I needed that kick in the butt because I didn't know how to learn. That was my biggest hindrance.
Welcome back to the Free Code Camp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. Each week we're bringing you insight from developers, founders, and ambitious people getting into tech. This week we're joined by Emma Bostian. She's a software engineer turned manager at Spotify and a prolific coding teacher. Emma, welcome to the Free Code Camp podcast.
Thanks for having me, Quincy. It's nice to actually talk in real life.
Yeah, you and I have been corresponding like asynchronously through email, Twitter messages, things like that for like years. And of course,
I know.
I've listened to so many podcasts that you've been on. Of course, like the Ladybug podcast that you created with several other women in tech. And of course, the many times you've been on like JS Party and different, technical podcasts that I enjoy listening to. So it's amazing to like, it's kind of surreal almost to talk to you in real time. And actually have me respond to things I said, because usually it's like this weird parasocial relationship.
I agree, yeah, and I've enjoyed watching the ascension of Free Code Camp, so yeah, it's great to meet.
Yeah, so where are you joining us from?
I am in Stockholm, Sweden.
Home of Spotify, of course.
Home of Spotify, H&M, Volvo, yeah.
Yeah, and as I frequently point out, because I'm very interested in like Swedish like management, style, Swedish culture, things like that. I am Swedish. I'm Larson, son of Lars.
Yeah.
I'm a fourth generation Swedish American. My great grandparents came over to Oklahoma and became farmers.
Wow.
Right before the Dust Bowl. Perfect timing, right?
Oh
So, yeah, it's cool that you're there, and I hope to eventually go out there. But I just want to I'm sure we'll get to Sweden, but I always like to start these conversations with jumping back to early days, Emma, what you were like when you were growing up, what your aspirations were. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what your childhood was like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in upstate New York, a couple hours north of New York City. Both of my parents worked at IBM for 30 plus years, and my dad still works there. So I grew up around tech, going to the bring your kid to work days, all of these things. So my dad being an engineer was always saying, you should get into tech, you should get into tech. I'm like, absolutely not. I'm not listening to anything you were saying. So I went to college for biology. I really, really wanted to be an obstetrician gynecologist as my career path, and very quickly realized I'm not very good at the natural sciences. Honestly, I wasn't very interested in it either. So I didn't do well my first semester in college. So I switched to actuarial science, more statistics, math-based, etc., where I ended up taking a computer science class, and I loved it. I also dabbled in music. I actually had applied to transfer colleges for music education, and my dad sat me down, and he was like, are you sure you want to do this? I'll support you, but are you really sure? I'm like, no, Dad. I'm like 17 years old. Of course I'm not sure. I don't know anything. So I stayed at my college, took that computer science course. I loved it. And at that point, I decided I would transition full-time to computer science and business. So that's more about my 19, 20-year-old. Of course, as a young child, I was chaotic, as we all are, right? But I always actually thought I would get into management. I couldn't tell you why. I loved leadership as a kid. I went to leadership camp when I was, 12 years old. I love reading books, especially books on communication and leadership and things of that nature. So I'm not shocked that I ended up in the role that I am in today, but my childhood and adolescence definitely prepared me for this.
Yeah. So, first of all, actuarial science, that's like really hardcore. I have some friends
Yeah.
who study that, and they know math. So like it's nobody's business. Like a huge, like it's probably one of the most pure applied math type jobs you can get, I would think. But it's so cool that you took a CS class and that like just pushed you in that direction. Obviously, computer science is also kind of like applied mathematics. I remember the university I went to back in the early 2000s, late 90s, was kind of like they had the CS department inside the math building because it was just thought of as like an extension of that. So, yeah, like having both parents working at IBM, which was and still is a huge tech company. I mean, it used to be the tech company back in like the 70s and 80s. If you've ever watched *Halt and Catch Fire*, the TV show, it's based around kind of like this little upstart that's trying to compete with IBM and like the laptop space and stuff like that. And they were like basically like the 800-pound gorilla.
Yeah. So I was a third generation. So
wow.
Yeah, okay. I wouldn't be here without them.
Yeah. So maybe you could talk about like what that was like having two parents who were working at kind of like in the pinnacle of tech at that time. And was there like some expectation that you were going to go work there?
Yeah. So first of all, how privileged was I to grow up where I did? And looking back, of course, you always take things for granted as a child, right? But to grow up in the Hudson Valley where you've got like the Culinary Institute of America and really great school system and parents with very steady jobs, I was very fortunate. But of course, you take those for granted as a child. That being said, I loved having my parents come in for, bring your parents to workday. They would always come do like the engineering workshops with the kids, talk about their jobs. So my dad was an engineer. Now he's a senior technical staff member. My mom was a designer for many years. So it's cool. I got the duality of design and engineering. But I very much was proud of them. I loved, bringing them to school, having them talk about their jobs. I loved going to the office with them and seeing what they did. Although I still don't know what they do, or did. There was no real expectation they would have supported me doing anything. And actually, it's ironic. They encouraged me not to join IBM when I graduated college, but I did end up ultimately joining for a few years. I did an internship and subsequently was there full-time for about 2 or so years. They encouraged me not to stay there full-time. They really wanted me to get out, try something new, not be so boxed into one company for my entire life.
Yeah. Well, what was it like being there? Like at this really old, because obviously you've worked at so many different places since then, including kind of like one of the big new tech royalty companies, Spotify, where you are now. Like what were your first years like as a developer working at IBM?
I absolutely struggled. I was unprepared for the role that I was thrust into. Of course, I interviewed and applied and all these things. I went through that process, but frankly, and now looking back when as a 30-year-old, I can identify why I struggled, which was I had ADHD and it went undiagnosed for 30 years. So I very much struggled to maintain information, to get tasks done. But at the time, I didn't understand why I was struggling. So while I studied computer science, I took one web development course. We just did the basics, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, 1 week on each of them, and then maybe a little bit of jQuery and some Bootstrap. And when I got hired at IBM, it was for a back-end role. And then, 2 months before starting, they said, just kidding, you're going to go into front end. So I was like, front end's easy, web is easy. I got there, I was completely overwhelmed. I probably cried every day for like the first several months because I was not only trying to learn a legacy code base and a new company with hundreds of thousands of employees. Also, I had moved down to Texas all by myself. I didn't really know many people. But I was also working with Dojo, which is, maybe not the nicest framework to be, working on the first time you get into web development. So I had a big reality check, I must admit. I think many of us can identify with the fact that as an adolescent and, a college student, in your early 20s, you think you're invincible. You think you know everything. You have an ego. I deserve this. I'm so smart. And then you get slapped in the face by reality. And that was a huge wake-up call for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it sounds like, first of all, I'd be very interested in diving more into your ADHD diagnosis if you want to talk about it, and like how you discovered that you had that, and what that meant as a developer, and like, the implications of now having that knowledge and potentially, treating it with medicine or how, doing other things that you do to counteract that. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Of course. It's actually something relatively new. For a long time, I would always joke around, I think I have ADHD, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, I'm quite certain that I do. In Sweden, it is very difficult to get an official ADHD diagnosis. You have to prove basically beyond a reasonable doubt that it is impacting your life so negatively that you're unable to function day to day. It's either impacting your career or your home life, your finances, etc., to the point where you need medication. So I've been to a therapist. She said, yes, your self-diagnosis is correct. I am quite certain of that. But you're also coping so well. You've created mechanisms to cope with the things that you struggle with to the point where we can't get an official diagnosis, which is, it's bittersweet, right? Because I am happy that I have these systems I put in place, but I'm also really tired of having to rely on them. So some of the ways this manifests for me in particular is I get bored so quickly. You'll probably tell by the amount of content I produced, several years ago. I was pushing out courses, podcasts, videos, books, you name it. I got into this focus state for like 1 month, just hammered out content, and I never touched it ever again. I cannot work on long-running projects without, immense difficulty. I'm very impulsive, specifically with like financial spending. I'll like get new habits, new hobbies that I'm very interested in and spend a bunch of money on it and then use it for a week and never touch it again, right? At work, it's really manifest with not being able to complete long-running projects, forgetting to do tasks, things of that nature.
Yeah. Interesting. So, like, a lot, like, if you've been following Emma on Twitter over the years, you've probably seen, like, this just sudden surge of, like, developer tutorials and things like that you're creating, and then kind of crickets for a while. And when you say you get new hobbies, can you give us examples of like things that you'll just suddenly get interested in but like totally lose interest in?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one hobby I've never lost interest in is books, but I feel of all the hobbies I could have, that's probably a good one, a lucrative one. Specifically, let's see, doing my nails during, COVID lockdown, I was like, I'm gonna buy all of the gel nail kit stuff. I'm gonna do it at home. I think it's good for my mental health. I spent probably like €200 on nail equipment, the lamps, the polishes, you name it. I used it 3 times and I gave up. I'm like, this is too much for me. And it's sitting in my closet. Now, of course, I'll probably give this to someone who will enjoy it and use it. But that's just one example of like, oh, I'm going to try to do this myself, save some money. End up spending a bunch of money. It gave me no reward.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you said you have systems to kind of like get things done in spite of this and work around it. When you say that you can't get a full diagnosis in Sweden, it's like, at least in the 80s, it was comically easy to get like an ADHD diagnosis, or ADD as they called it back then. And that, in fact, I was diagnosed with ADD and had to take Ritalin for a couple years, and like I didn't like how it made me feel. Ritalin being like a precursor to, I guess, Adderall, which is what more people take nowadays, but it's basically an amphetamine that is supposed to help you focus. And I would actually get like to the point where I would like keep the pill in my mouth in the morning, and then as soon as like my parents were out of sight, I'd spit it out because I just didn't like it. But at the same time, my parents insisted. So like in the U.S., it was like way overdiagnosed to the point that I think a lot of people, it became kind of like almost a meme. Like people would joke,
yeah,
I kind of got ADD about that, or like I'm kind of anal retentive about that, like kind of like almost like glossing over how serious a lot of these conditions can be, like obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, can be completely debilitating, and that's to say nothing of like the really serious things like bipolar and things like that. But but I don't believe I have ADHD. I think I was just like misdiagnosed because, I count myself lucky that I can generally focus pretty well. But like, so were you not able to obtain any sort of medication or anything like that in Sweden, or?
No, you need an official diagnosis, and it takes a long time to get through that process. And it depends on if you're public or private healthcare, right? So if you go through the public system, it can take 2 years to even see someone to start this diagnosis process. If you go the private route, you're going to end up paying like €2,000 or more just to see someone and see if they'll diagnose you. For me personally, like ever since I expatriated myself from the United States back in 2018, I actually have shifted my mindset because I used to take medication for everything. I used to have sleep problems, and I would, I walk into the urgent care and they're like, oh, we're going to give you Xanax. I'm like, I don't need Xanax. Like, I'm a young kid. Like, I ended up not taking it on my own. But anyway, when I left the U.S., I really didn't want to have to take medication to solve problems, where in the U.S., it's very, very common to immediately jump to medication. However, I would very much be open-minded to the possibility of medication now. The only stipulation is I'm still in the phase of wanting to expand my family, and I don't believe that they make pregnancy-safe ADHD medication. I could be wrong. That's the only reason I'm not actively pursuing it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about these systems. We have so much to talk about. We're going to talk about other things, but while we're on this topic, what are some tricks and tips? And of course, this is not medical advice. I'm not a physician. I don't purport to have any expertise in this. But let's say hypothetically there's somebody who's in a similar situation where they suspect they have ADHD or even been told that they have ADHD, but they're unable to obtain, medicine for it, or they just don't want to do the medicine. Like, I think they'd benefit from learning a little bit about kind of these systems and techniques you've used to like kind of rein in that, to work around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's still a work in progress, and it always will be. I definitely struggle to build and maintain new habits. However, some of the things I find that work really well for me are finding a handful of tools that I very much enjoy. Of course, I thrive with like new things. I'm always looking for something new to like spark the response in my brain, right? But I found a handful of tools that work really well for me. So Fantastical is an app I use to aggregate all of my Google calendars into one view. That prevents me from having to like open a bunch of tabs, etc., for like my many email accounts. Having a to-do application that I really enjoy. I use Todoist for that. I've tried them all, and that seems to be the only one that works for me. Additionally, finding a community of people who are working through some of the same challenges that I'm facing has been very helpful. Just being able to commiserate with one another over silly things that, are easy for neurotypical folks, but for some of us is more difficult. What else? And I think honestly, the biggest thing for me, and maybe this isn't a system, but being more forthcoming with my team about my mental health and without dumping a lot of stuff onto them, being mindful of that. But like, hey, y'all, like, I just, I'm struggling today to maintain focus. If I speak over you, I'm really sorry. Like, I didn't mean to cut you off. Just being more aware of the behaviors that I'm exhibiting in meetings and whatnot. Whereas, if I talk over someone, I'll be like, oh, Johanna, I'm really sorry. I just talked over you. Please finish your sentence. So more self-awareness.
Yeah.
And then I guess maybe habit chaining. I love the book Atomic Habits. We talk about it all the time on the podcast a couple years ago. But when you're developing a new habit, I try to chain it on to habits that I've already implemented so that it's, it's almost like a trigger, like a positive trigger, like, oh, after I check my email, I'm going to go do this. That's been helpful. And then also doing my most difficult and dread-worthy task first thing in the morning, getting it out of the way, and then I don't have to think about it. Otherwise, I'll keep it in my like working mind the entire day, and I can't sleep until it's done.
Yeah, I am guilty of. There's this great webcomic where it's like the guy's standing there, the comic book character is standing there, and he's kind of got like the velvet rope, and there are all these big circles with big heavy faces on them, like in line. And it's like, this task, this task, this task. And then there's like this giant task that needs to be done. And he lets everybody in through the velvet rope, except for the last one. He said, you'll have to wait for tomorrow. And of course, you do that every day. And this task just becomes this kind of boogeyman in your mind. Like, oh my goodness. Like I have this big email sitting in my inbox. And I hit inbox 0 like 3 times, but I haven't dealt with this email because this person sent me like this really large thing of work that I need to do. I mean, it's important. It doesn't need to be nothing, but I want to do this properly. but at the same time, I feel like I'm just like making an excuse to buy myself some extra time when I could just sit down and do it instead of doing all the little tiny tasks that would, bunched up take about the same amount of time. Those could wait, and I could do the big task first.
Yeah.
So, I definitely, I can relate to that.
I talked about this previously as well, where I intentionally procrastinate on some of the larger tasks. So let's say, for example, I have to create a course, right? That's a big task. Where do you even begin? I will intentionally procrastinate for a few weeks. Meanwhile, in the back of my mind, I am picking apart all of the different routes that I could take to do this. So I'm intentionally procrastinating so that my mind in the background is kind of figuring out the puzzle pieces before I go to sit down and do the puzzle. And I have found that that works really well for me, because if I was to sit down on day one and start working on it, I guarantee you by the final product, it would look nothing like it. So I'm trying to use that to my benefit, but it doesn't always work out.
Yeah, like sometimes, writer's block, as somebody who writes a lot of technical tutorials like you do in books and things like that, I've heard writer's block described as just not knowing enough about the topic that you're trying to write about. And it's like your gut telling you, hey, you need to do some more research, or you need to sketch out more detailed outlines before you try to sit down and bang out the book. And I think that might apply for a lot of things. Like I read this productivity book, Getting Things Done, which I guess is like one of the more popular, airport business books that you see when you're like walking through the airport bookstores. But basically, breaking tasks into smaller bits so that they're not this giant daunting task, but like, hey, just a lot of little tasks, right? Like writing a book might be, instead of like just step one, sit down and write the book, right? No, step one would be like, okay, figure out, a rough outline of what you want the book to cover. Okay, now research this topic. Now research this topic. Now write this, preface. This, I start with like a 500 word executive summary, and then I can expand that, and then I can go and retouch that as development of the book goes. So breaking things down into smaller chunks and things like that. So, habit chaining. That's not I haven't read the book Atomic Habits, so I hear about it all the time. Can you maybe give one or more examples of like other habit chaining things that you've found to be helpful over the years?
It's a good question. So what recently I've tried to do is, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm going through some health issues, and I've told myself, okay, I'm going to take a break from all things to do with that, and I'm going to spend 75 days. If you've heard of 75 Hard, it's an immensely large challenge that has a lot of requirements, right? So you're supposed to do like 2 45-minute workouts a day, one of which is outside, and you have to read 10 pages of a nonfiction book, drink, however many liters of water, and no alcohol, and et cetera, et cetera. So they have a bunch of rules, and it's very difficult. That's why it's called 75 Hard, but you do it for 75 days. I've never done anything consistently for that long except be a parent and exist. So it was a challenge to myself that I'm going to do a softer version of that. And what I did is I printed out a habit tracker and I stuck it on my fridge where I have accountability. That's maybe one thing. Get an accountability partner, right? For me, if I'm not spending money on something, I am going to be less likely to commit to doing it consistently. So for me, I'm like, okay, I have the habit tracker that I physically cross off every single day. I can't miss it. It's on the fridge. I go there often, right? And now my husband can also see if I'm living up to my own desires. So I think maybe accountability is a big one when you're trying to develop new habits. Yeah, and I guess maybe I think they also talk about to discontinue a negative habit is way more difficult than to introduce more of a positive one. So maybe another tactic could be, instead of just trying to stop a negative habit, to change your current behavior to be a little bit more positive, and over time, that negative behavior is now remediated to some extent. Yeah,
absolutely. So in terms of like, I want to dive into like what a typical day for you is like, because you talked about like putting a calendar type thing on the fridge and then having your husband look at it, and he can kind of like chide you, oh, did you actually do this today?
Yeah.
Well, things like that. like, so you kind of got these external systems, accountability partner, in your husband, and also just documenting everything, so you can't really get away with like fudging, so to speak. Like FreeCodeCamp, we have like a streak thing. Some people say streak is bad, and GitHub actually like got rid of their streak. You can add a plugin and you can see like the streak and stuff like that. But I guess it like simple mechanisms like that do work, in my opinion. Like I have like this no 0 day thing that I learned from Sean Wang, where basically like every day you have to do like a push-up, and as long as you do one push-up, it's not a 0 day, you know. So I don't do that with push-ups, but I do that with like, you know, studying foreign languages and with playing bass. Like I have to play bass every single day. I have to pick up my bass and actually play it, you know, and it doesn't matter how long I played. Maybe I'll play for like an entire hour, but it's not a 0 day if I play that day. So I found like with habits, like the simpler the system, the more, I guess, easy it is to like internalize that and just say, well, I got to do this right now. Like, yeah, but what is a typical day like for you? And like, how do you kind of organize your day to be able to work around ADHD and also work around like all the other distractions in your life?
So I find that when I work from home, I'm most focused. We have a beautiful office in central Stockholm, but it's open concept. And to be honest, I spend the majority of my day in meetings with other people because my team is split across several countries across Europe. So I find that staying home, I'm much more productive. Additionally, I have like a long commute, like over an hour each way by train. So I try to stay home. So I'll bring my daughter to preschool at 7 every morning. And I also find that getting out for a walk outside helps my mental clarity. So I will drop her at school and go for about a 30-minute walk, get home around 8:15, eat a little breakfast, and then start working. I generally catch up on all my notifications first. I disable all my notifications for everything, social media, Slack, etc. My phone's on Do Not Disturb at all times. So I check Slack, I check my email, and then I'll work on whatever my biggest task is. Right now, we're creating roadmaps for the next 6 months of our product life cycle. So that's the first thing I did this morning, was turn our commitments for the next 6 months into a roadmap. And then we've got our team stand up at 10. So 10 is really like the official start of my day. But I try to get outside every morning and make sure that I eat well, drink some water, and then sit down for my hardest task before jumping into all my meetings. And then, yeah, it's mostly meetings all day. I have a couple focus days, but otherwise it's mostly meetings. And then I quit around 4 to go get my daughter. And sometimes I have meetings in the evenings if need be.
Okay, awesome. That's so a lot of meetings, it sounds like.
Yeah.
But you do like the same thing that I do. And of course, like this isn't you interviewing me, but I will jump out and I'll echo that I think it's very important to get out of the house in the morning. I have 2 young kids that wake up. We call them roosters. Like when the sun is up, they are up. And kids don't sleep in. At least not in my
maybe you shouldn't come to Sweden because the sun comes up at 4 here.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Maybe they would adapt, but they wake up like basically 6:30, and like I wake up and like my daughter was like jacked my phone and she's like watching like Zelda Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom type videos of just silly things, and like, or she's playing the Suica game, which is like the watermelon game. I don't know if you've been cursed with that.
No.
Yeah, don't look it up. So we like, and she's up, and so I have to wake up and like quickly make the tea, and then I take them to school, I drop them off at school, and then I also, like you, I like to just walk around, walk over to the YMCA, I exercise, I walk back, and then usually my day starts at 9. So like, just like you, kids and exercise are the first things to start my day. And I also am privileged enough to work from home as well. So yeah, like I'm able to do everything right here at my standing desk and get a whole lot done and have some flexibility. I can even eat like lunch with my wife and stuff. It was like such a privilege to be able to spend so much time with my family. Yeah. And so it sounds like you do a lot of meetings, which means that like you've got a calendar, and you even mentioned that you use a calendar app to kind of bring all your calendars together. What type of meetings are you having as a manager at Spotify? And we're going to get into the software engineering later, everybody. Don't worry about that. But I'm just curious, while we're talking about meetings, there's this joke that like in software development, like weeks of coding can save you hours of meetings, right? Because so many people have it in their mind, like, meetings are bad. I don't want to work somewhere where I'm doing meetings. I don't want to code, and stuff like that. But like, a lot of working in a team is communication. Maybe you could talk a little bit about like Spotify's meeting culture and what kind of things you're discussing. Obviously not anything proprietary or anything like that, but just a general vibe for like what those meetings are like and how you go about it. Absolutely.
So I'm a manager now, which of course I have more meetings, right? My direct team members, we call them direct reports. It's so funny because I'll go to schedule a one-on-one with them. I have one-on-ones with every single one of them every week. And I have I think I have 6 now engineers. So that's 6 hours of meetings right there. I'm sorry, divide that by 2. In any case, I go to
30-minute meetings.
Yeah, generally. Yep. I go to schedule a meeting with them and I'm like, oh my gosh, your calendar's so open. I love that for you. Must be nice. So I'm very intentional about not taking up their time with meetings. That's something very important to me and also very important to them. And they make sure to tell me if they think something doesn't need to be a meeting or if I'm taking too much of their time. For me, yeah, like I mentioned, I have one-on-ones every week that it's their time. So they can choose to talk about whatever they'd like to talk about. I also, we're in the planning season. We have a few weeks worth of planning that determine the next 6 months. So lots of meetings with my product manager and my designer on what we're going to be working on. We have meetings with our dependent teams, people that so I work on the desktop and web player team. We do the UI for both of those applications. And so we'll have meetings with our stakeholders that we depend on for data. Like, are they prioritizing this for this upcoming 6 months? If so, when are they going to deliver that so we can build the UI for it? I have leadership meetings every week with our product area. So this is, other teams like TV or entertainment systems, things of that nature. And all of us engineering managers get together with our tech leads, our staff engineers to discuss anything we need to discuss, whether that's compensation reviews coming or how is your team looking health check wise. We do like health checks to see if people are happy and healthy and all of those things mentally. We have all hands. There was actually a meeting right before this with the 2 co-presidents of the company where they're just answering all of our questions. I do meetings with other managers and a team member who wants to come sit with us for 6 months and help us deliver. We do embeds internally so people can come try out different teams, different product roles. They can try out product management, engineering management, engineering on different platforms, things of that nature. So I would say that's the bulk of it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, well, that's a lot of meetings, but it sounds like everything could be clearly described in terms of the purpose. Yeah. You're not just sitting around for no reason, like just chatting. Like everything has purpose-driven. Can you? Yeah. So you're a manager, obviously. Like, congratulations again. I know that as a kid you read like all these books, and now you're actually doing it. You're managing people, and that's after like pretty long career or many years of working as a software engineer as like an individual contributor. And I see. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about Swedish management culture? Because it is different. Like Scandinavian business culture is different from the U.S. in that I think it's less hierarchical and more consensus driven. I've heard, like, even though you're the manager, you're kind of like listening and trying to understand. In the U.S., like at a large corporation, it'll almost be run like a military in a way that there's like, my understanding, is title matters a lot more. And this is certainly the case in Japan, where I worked for like a giant, Japanese conglomerate for a few years. And it was very much like title, seniority, like all the other considerations. It's more about who you are than what you have to say. How is it in Sweden?
Yeah. People identify, in my experience in the United States, is people identify with their titles. Like if you ask me like, oh, tell me about yourself, I'd be like, well, I'm an engineering manager at Spotify. That's how I would identify myself. Nowadays, it's more like, oh, I'm a mom. I'm an American who's moved abroad, things of that nature. So in Sweden, they have this concept of lagom, which means everything in moderation, not too much, not too little, just right. So that pertains to, talking about yourself, your personal belongings. You're not going to want to drive the flashiest car. And if you do, you're not going to brag about it to anyone or, it's considered braggart-y.
Yeah.
So that concept is very ingrained in the culture. Although I will say we are run very similarly to maybe more of like a U.S. tech giant to some extent, not always. But I think, Spotify does have, millions of monthly active users, right? So we're kind of operating like a Netflix or a Twitter, right? So I would say that leadership is much more accessible than at other companies that are U.S. based that I've worked for, right? So you had mentioned consensual decision making versus hierarchical decision making. That's very true in Sweden. Leadership is it's much more flat in terms of not structure, but in terms of how we operate day to day. So leadership is much more accessible. They have town halls where we can ask questions to the CEO, things of that nature. But yeah, so here's an example with the consensual decision making. There was a thread going on in Slack the other day about the right way to be building a specific feature. And it was getting long. I mean, there were probably 35 messages in this thread, and I stepped in at some point and I was, I was saying, is there a reason we shouldn't do it this way? I think maybe this is the right approach here. And one of my senior engineers, they responded and they were like, I disagree, and here's why. And I'm like, I love that. I love that they disagreed with me, because I say this all the time to them. I see myself as your peer to an extent. I know on paper I am technically your manager and I'm responsible for a lot of stuff, but I don't see myself as above you in any way. And I want you to tell me if you think I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So, having that culture is very valuable for me. And I ended up, saying, you know what, I shouldn't have stepped in here. And I'm happy that you said something to me about it in the public setting, right? I want you to keep doing that. And the team member ended up, disagreeing with the way forward after my product manager came in, and they said, you know what, I disagree, but I'm going to do the work anyway. And I gave them feedback. I said, that mentality is very healthy. We can have these discussions. We can disagree. However, the ability to kind of disagree and commit, like strong opinions loosely held, is very important. I think that's maybe more of a U.S. American behavior that you might see in a company, is like, oh, if the boss says this, you got to go with it, right? But in Sweden, it's much more, we have the consensual discussion. We might not all agree, but we're still going to come to a conclusion and go with it, even if we're not all 100% certain that's the right way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's like so powerful in the sense that when you don't have that ability for somebody to pipe up and share a dissenting view because they're afraid that they're going to, strain some political relationship within the organization, or they're going to be seen as, difficult to work with or something like that, then you can really tap the brains of like all the different smart people that you work so hard to recruit for your organization, right? Because, and that happened, to me the other day. Like I'm the manager of freeCodeCamp, right? I don't meet with people every single week, but I think I have like 33 different direct charges, in the sense that we have like kind of a flat structure and I'm just the only manager in the organization. But, like we were in a meeting, like it was a platform development meeting, and or I think it was a curriculum development meeting. And one of our team members, she pushed back on like kind of my naive, like, maybe we could try this. And she's like, no, I think it's better to do this. We talked about it for a while and we realized, oh, actually she's right. We should just take this approach. And so, strong opinions loosely held. In this case, it was kind of like a weak opinion, which we held because I was just like spitballing. But like it was music to my ears, having people dissent and having other people chime in and like even say, yeah, I think she's right, Quincy.
Mm-hmm.
Like this would be a better approach. And for me to say, okay, cool. And it's something where like, if I were like, a manager in an organization and I had like a bunch of managers above me and I was like desperately kind of clinging to power and like a big bureaucracy and something like that, I might feel like I had lost face, but I didn't feel that at all. I felt like we just arrived at a healthier conclusion, and I actually felt the organization was healthier than ever as a result of that whole exchange. So, of course, I'm in a very privileged position in that it's very difficult for me to get fired as the executive director of freeCodeCamp. But, really, like, I have a high degree of autonomy, and like, aside from a board, there's like nobody telling me what to do. We don't have any investors or anything like that. So pardon me if I come across as like, oh, no big deal. Just let your, subordinates like publicly call you out. It's not a big deal, right? But it actually, I think it's really great that, in Sweden, this is kind of like institutionalized in kind of the business culture. That's so cool. So again, I don't mean to like I mentioned before the call, like, I'm of Swedish descent, and I, fourth generation Swedish American, and I like long to go back. I've got lots of Swedish friends who are always telling me like how cold it is up there. But
it snowed last week, so
yeah, it snowed in
yeah.
April.
But I will say Spotify is very multinational, multicultural. So actually, I wouldn't say this is the standard across every team in the organization. We have, a good amount of Swedish folks on our team, but I think it's really a team culture thing as well. We kind of decide how we want to work. But I'll be honest, I want to be the least intelligent person in the room, frankly. So I want them to challenge me, and I want to learn from them. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I want to be the least intelligent person in the room. That is way to be. I remember when I was working as a software engineer, you can read all about my developer journey and how to learn to code and get a developer job book that I published a year ago for free. It's just Google learn to code book, and it should be the top result. But I'll spare you like the detail of the story. But basically, one of my managers was like, "Oh, I'm very confident that you're the worst engineer here on our team." And I was like, "Oh, damn." He said, "No, that's good because you always want to be the worst person in the band." Like you always want to be surrounded by the musicians who are way better than you, because that is like, that means you're in the right crowd, and that means you're going to grow, right? So like, I just want to echo that sentiment. Like, it may seem counterintuitive that you want to be the least intelligent person in the room, but that means you're in the right room, right?
Well, and also intelligence and competence are two separate things, right? You can be highly, highly competent while still having the least amount of intelligence on a specific topic.
Yeah. And sometimes like having too much intelligence on the topic can give you pause, whereas like somebody who didn't know better would just dive in and, potentially take a bunch of risks, but it ultimately gets something done. So yeah, there's definitely a distinction between getting things done and being smart. And I always like to say I vastly prefer, having team members who get things done than people who are, sitting there and like, reading Goethe or something and like thinking very like epistemologically about every little decision that they make or something like that, right? So, yeah, well, that's really cool. I want to get deeper into the Europe connection. You grew up in the U.S., in New York. You probably could have just stayed in the U.S. and had a career here, but it seems like pretty early on you were interested in Europe, and my understanding is you studied abroad in the UK during undergrad. Can you talk about that?
I did, yeah. It was so tragic because I was coming off of what I thought was the worst breakup of my life. I was in college. I was so dramatic. They're like, well, I don't need to be in this country anymore. I'm going to run away. And so I did. And it was the best decision I ever made. So I went to London for 3 months and I studied at City University. I did horribly in all my classes. Are we surprised? No. But I had the best time of my life. And I really developed a love of traveling and seeing new cultures and all of that. And yeah, ultimately led me to moving to Germany for a few years and then subsequently to Sweden, where I've been for almost 4 years now.
Yeah. What was just the cultural differences between the UK, obviously an English-speaking country. I've heard that the country where the U.S. has the most failed kind of like business relationships in the world is not someplace with a dramatically different culture, like Japan, for example, but someplace that seems to have a very similar culture, like the UK, because we take so much for granted about like, oh, they're just like us, right? They're just on the other side of the Atlantic. But no, there's actually a lot of cultural differences between the US and the UK. Maybe you could compare and contrast like some of your experiences in those three major countries over there in Europe and like, yeah, what those experiences were like.
Yeah. In all honesty, I didn't get to know many British folks when I was living in London. I had lived with other people I had 3 American roommates and one guy was from the Netherlands. And of course I didn't have any like differences with the Americans, like culturally speaking. I don't remember having any like culture shocks with the Dutch roommate either. We just got along really well. Of course, it was much easier to get around in the UK because I spoke English, and so it was very easy to travel to Scotland or south to Brighton. Very easy to get around. when I moved to Germany, I was like a toddler, a 25-year-old toddler. I didn't know what I was doing because I had to learn the language. I was very reliant on my partner at the time to essentially help me survive day to day. I didn't understand basically anything, right? So, for example, there are no turnstiles on the trains in Germany. And so I'm like, oh, I don't even need to buy a ticket. Like, this is great. Well, no, you do need to buy a ticket and you need to validate that ticket. And if, there are ticket takers coming around and you don't have a ticket, well, you're in trouble, right? But me not seeing any turnstiles where I'm used to in the US and in the, in London, I'm like, oh, it's free. I'll just hop on there, right? So little things like that. I moved to Sweden. I definitely had culture shocks here, even though I find it to be very similar to the United States in a lot of ways. For example, I went to go mail a package and I walk up, in the US, you line up for things, you queue for things. So you stand in a line and wait to get to the front, to the counter, and you mail your package. Well, I didn't know that. And I was waiting and I walk up to the counter and he goes, what's your number? I'm like, what do you mean, what's my number? He was like, you need to go back there and take a number out of like the number pulling system and wait until your number is called. That's how they do it in Sweden. You go take a number out of the number pull and wait for it to show up. And I'm like, I haven't seen this since, the 90s when I had to wait at the deli with my parents when I was young. Like, What is this? And now I'm like, oh, this is the best system ever because you can go peruse the store. You don't have to wait in line, right? You can go like do the rest of your shopping.
Yeah.
But that was one big culture shock. It's, there are deeper ones, of course, regarding family or here's a big one my husband and I were talking about yesterday. They don't do baby showers here when you get pregnant. You don't have a baby registry or a wedding registry when you get married. And so I told him yesterday, oh, my best friend, like, she's having her baby shower in a month. I just want you to know I bought a couple of things off her registry. He was like, what is that? I'm like, what do you mean? It's where you go to Amazon or to another big store and you register for all the items that you want. People buy it for you for your shower. He was like, what is that? That would not exist here. And when I got pregnant with my daughter, I was like, why can't I register online for anything? I don't understand. So,
yes,
nothing major, but
yeah, those very tiny things that I guess you would take for granted. Yeah. So were there any like really big cultural shocks in Sweden, like where you're like, whoa, this is like totally different? I've never even heard of this.
Honestly, no. I find Sweden, and I say Sweden, I only live in Stockholm, but I've traveled around a little bit. I find it to be so approachable, and the systems are very well maintained. It's funny because whenever my family visits, then I maybe notice things a little bit more. But if you just straight up ask me that, I'll come up with something tonight, and I'll probably DM you like, oh yeah, this is like a big one. As of right now, I really can't think of much. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited that you're having this multicultural experience, like, and it sounds like you've really set yourself up. Like, I always tell people, everybody should try to study abroad if they have the privilege to do so. And if you live abroad, like, if you have a U.S. passport, that you can basically go anywhere. Like, there are a few countries where you have to apply for like visas and do other stuff, but like the U.S. passport is like the most OP, passport you can have in terms of just being able to OP overpowered. Like, you can basically like go a lot of places where you just show up and they just give you like a visa waiver and you walk in and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of people don't take full advantage of that if they have U.S. citizenship. But I'm really interested in talking about kind of your career progression, because I want to dive into what your early years were like working as a software engineer. I know that you said that you immediately got bumped to the front end and you didn't know very much about it. What was it like working at IBM and having to, did you have like imposter syndrome? Did you have a whole lot of other kind of like difficulties that you had to like surmount? And what was it like that time before you left? Do you feel like you progressed a lot during that period?
My first year, no, I was pretty stagnant. And in fact, I remember the person who was set out to mentor me basically told me, you need to get your stuff together or you're not going to do well in this industry. And I remember at the time being like, how dare they say this to me, that's so awful. And now I'm looking back on it, I'm like, they were totally right. And I needed that kick in the butt because I didn't know how to learn. That was my biggest hindrance. I didn't know how to learn. I didn't know where to go look up information. I didn't understand how to read tech docs. So my biggest hurdle was learning how to learn and learning where to go for answers. So instead of just immediately asking a colleague, what does splice do for an array in JavaScript? Oh, I can actually go to Mozilla Developer Network and learn this, or go to freeCodeCamp and learn this. Amazing, right? So I struggled for probably a year. At that point, my manager could see that I was not thriving. I wasn't doing well. And part of that, going back to my ADHD, undiagnosed, I was really, really good at the stuff I was passionate about, and everything else I did not care about at all. And I was working on enterprise storage systems, not the nicest thing for me personally. I wasn't very interested in it. So I didn't care enough to learn how to learn properly. After about a year, I transitioned to a design team. And I was very creative growing up. I was very much into music and things of that. I wasn't artistic, but I loved music and creativity and things like that. So being on a design team as the only engineer, I loved it. I thrived a lot more because I got to use the newer web technologies. I got to pick what I used. So I got to try Vue on one project and React on another project and things like that. So I got to try lots of new things that kept me interested. At that point, I started thriving a little bit more. But honestly, it wasn't until, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I've never felt like a very good software engineer. I've always felt an imposter syndrome, and I'm able to recognize that I was pretty decent at my job, but frankly, I wasn't excellent at it. And I don't think I ever would have been excellent as an engineer. So I'm very happy that I transitioned to management, because where I was excelling was at the conceptual technical level, understanding these concepts and being able to communicate them effectively to other people. That's where I thrive. So management is actually the perfect role for me. I don't have to do the coding day to day, but I get to understand the technical concepts and work through it that way.
Yeah, that's a big admission. And, I definitely applaud you for just kind of accepting, like, I'm just not that interested in day-to-day coding. And the benefit, and many people listening to this may be like, oh, I hope I'm not coding like 20 years from now. A lot of people love it. And a lot of people just want to be an IC. I have friends working at big tech companies that like never want to be a manager. And they're so grateful that there's some management above kind of insulating them from the whims of, the other managers and stuff. Like they've got kind of like a champion internally who clears the path so they can just sit down and focus on getting things done as far as like building out features and tests and things like that. So, but that's really cool. And I applaud you for like kind of coming to that revelation. Also, it's worth noting that like, once you were able to change into like a design role and you could go and grab your own tools, that kind of like played into your, curiosity. You had kind of like this roving interest in different things. And so that gave you some customizability, it sounds like, and allowed you to express yourself a little bit more, rather than just working. I think you mentioned you were working on like some enterprise storage system, which I can imagine that's, probably a great driver of revenue for IBM. They get these giant contracts from like the Department of Defense or, like other large corporations, and they just need to build and maintain these systems and keep them going potentially for decades, right? But it's not like exciting, like dynamic, probably, I would imagine.
Right. Yeah. And when I switched to the design team, I got to do the coolest projects. I mean, I got to build the IBM quantum computing network site. I don't even know what it's called anymore, but it was essentially the home page for quantum computing at IBM, which was the up and coming project that I worked on right before I left. I loved that because building a website from scratch is so fun for me, right? Well, when I moved to Germany, I joined GoToMeeting, again, working on an engineering team. It was okay for me, but where I really thrived was design systems. It was all like UI focused, so I didn't have to get back into API stuff. It was just React or web components and HTML, CSS, and I loved it. I loved building a design system. So if I had to code again, I would definitely do design systems. But I don't foresee myself leaving management. Yeah.
Well, I do want to kind of explore your career a little bit more, because you left IBM after a few years. And what was the process like? My understanding is you worked at a lot of different places. Like, did you
3 companies.
three
Yeah.
companies? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Did you after IBM, what kind of things did you optimize for in your next job?
A visa, to be frank with you. That's
Okay.
really. So I had met my partner at the time. He was also working at IBM, and I went through the entire process of interviewing at IBM in Germany. And I got to the end. They said, we'd love to hire you. We just don't have the budget to do it. So I had to look for another company, and it could have been anywhere in Germany, honestly. But I ended up at GoToMeeting, which was quite fun.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I think it's a good product. So I enjoyed, the proposition value there. But frankly, yeah, I was looking for a company that would take a chance on me. I mean, many of the German companies were like, why would we invest in bringing someone over, having to sponsor their visa, helping them move when we have talent over here already? I'm so incredibly grateful for that experience. And to my partner at the time for helping me with all of the culture shock and whatnot. But yeah, that's frankly, I mean, that was not a job search that warranted a wish list. That was kind of the job search that I'm like, I need to move out of the country. I've already told my lease that I'm leaving. I've already told my job that I'm leaving. Like, I kind of had a fire under my butt to get something. So it wasn't a luxurious job search.
Yeah. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about like the application process. Like, so you have a computer science degree. You have a couple of years of work history at IBM. Probably have like a portfolio you can point to. Let's say hypothetically that you didn't have some of those things. Like, one of the things that you've been very vociferous about, I'm not sure if that's like I don't mean that in a peculiar way. Like, you've been very vocal about a lot of the things you learned in your computer science degree weren't directly applicable to your job. And you've said, like, in big, bold, like all caps, like, you don't need a computer science degree. I think you've tweeted that before. So, like, what is it about a computer science degree that was helpful, and what do you think was kind of like chaff?
Yeah. I want to just call out the fact that a computer science degree is extraordinarily helpful for folks who are perhaps underrepresented or, rely on having that piece of paper to give, I don't want to say credibility, because their credibility is not based on that, right? But superficially, a lot of companies will see that and be like, oh, okay, we're going to hire a CS graduate. I mean, there were so many takes on Twitter that said, I'll never hire someone without a CS degree. And it's like, you shouldn't have that view, but a lot of places do, unfortunately. So it gives you that quote unquote credibility that some companies think that you need in order to get hired. It also gives, others, I mean, going to college gives you skills that, of course, you could get at working full-time, working part-time. You can get these skills other places. It gives you a network. I would say that's a huge benefit, right? Networking with alumni or professors or etc. You can get opportunities that way. Skill set wise, frankly, I learned more on freeCodeCamp and YouTube than I learned in my degree, specifically because at the time the degree was so Java focused. I didn't learn anything other than Java for the most part. So it left me wholly unprepared for a job in web development or anything to do with design. Didn't know those were options. To be fair, it was a small liberal arts college, so the catalog was not extensive.
Yeah.
But, as a hiring manager now, I don't have a preference or a bias towards folks who have degrees or don't have degrees. I've had to consciously check the bias of, oh, it looks like you went to the same school as me or the same age as me. That's nice. Check your unconscious bias there. But, I have no preference if you went to college for anything, let alone computer science. It's really about your growth mindset and how you approach challenges. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the common, vantage point of some companies.
Yeah. Well, let's say you had a magic wand and you could just, boop, fix the developer interview process and kind of the hiring process for, people who are getting a first developer job. What are some changes you would make to, like, because you've been through a lot of developer interviews, right, at a lot of big companies, what are some things you would immediately change with your wand if you could do that to just make it a more humane, transparent, like, reasonable process for busy folks who are probably, under a lot of financial pressure. Maybe they have student debt, maybe they have kids, and they need to get a job, they need to get paid, or they need to get a visa, right? What are some things that you would change?
I have a lot. So the first, and this is maybe more perhaps in terms of like the systems set in place by companies, have probationary periods. This is the biggest guardrail for companies who complain that we need an extensive interview process because we need to validate whether this hire is going to be good or not. It's a huge investment. And yes, that is true. It's also an investment on the person joining your company, right? They're giving up a lot. So probationary periods are very standard in many European countries. 6 months is the standard in Sweden, as it was in Germany, I believe. Both company and employee, after 6 months, evaluate whether or not this is a lucrative partnership for both sides and if they want to continue it. That helps reduce the burden on the interview process, right? That being said, something Spotify did very well, and frankly, their interview process was the reason I joined the company. It was so humane. So it was still long. I don't want to, brush over that. It was the standard, you've got a coding phone screen, you've got, on-site interviews. I think there were 3 of them, and then, cultural interview as well. But it was humane. So we had a minimum of, or we had 2 interviewers for every interview, which helps reduce unconscious bias when they're submitting their feedback. Both interviewers will submit it in isolation, and then they'll have a calibration meeting after to discuss if they, if someone was too harsh or too lenient, etc. But they submit, before they speak to each other. Only one leads the interview. So you're not getting like a ton of input from all sides, but it is more like a collaboration. So as opposed to having like question and answer interviews, do collaboration, do code together, right? I always used to tell the interviewees that this is a collaboration, and I want you to be able to look things up on your own. I want you to ask questions. I'll ask questions if I don't. I've learned things from candidates, right? So approach it as a paired programming exercise. I think the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Controversial take is whether or not to get rid of the on-site interviews or have a take-home coding challenge. This is where it gets tricky, right? Because having a take-home project is very good for people who don't do well under pressure. It gives them the time to use the tools that they're comfortable with in a non-pressure environment. However, if you've got a family or you've got a sick family member that you're caring for, or you're working 2 jobs, it's not feasible for everyone, right? So there's a subset of people that a take-home project is not fair for. It's not equitable or equal in the process for. That being said, having a live coding session is also exhausting and artificial. So like I said, approach it more from a pair programming perspective. But the biggest thing you can do is to give them the choice. Do you want to take home or do you want to do a live session? And I know that means the process is not going to be identical for every person in the same pipeline for the same role. But, I think giving people the choice to, do you want to do this or this? Depending on your life circumstances, I think is great. And if you can pay them for their time, that's the ideal state. I remember I interviewed for a role where they said, hey, you can pick from any of these 3 challenges. These challenges are not obscure. They actually are things that you would be doing on this job. And we're going to pay you for your time. And you know what I realized? That paying people for their time is great and you should do it. But also, I didn't like this job. I wasn't going to like it. If I had joined, I would have probably ended up leaving. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. Give people relevant problems, pay them for their time, give them some sort of choice in how they go about the exam. I shouldn't even say that word, but that's almost what it is these days. Yeah.
Okay. Give people relevant problems, relevant to the work, so they can get a taste of what's going to be done. Give them a choice of whether they do a take home or like a kind of like real time coding challenge, and give them a compensation ideally. Because people are busy, people's time is valuable, and applying for hundreds of jobs just to get a few interviews and then having to go through the process is so inefficient.
I know.
And with these applicant tracking systems, you don't check the degree box, you're out, and you're never going to know that's why or anything, because everybody's so worried about like discrimination lawsuits and stuff like that. that they will almost never give you feedback. You're lucky if you even get like an email saying they're looking for other client candidates or something like that, right? So, like I think these 3 things you proposed, like I just want to second them. I think they're all great ideas. Obviously, they're not free for the company, but if you want to get high quality candidates, the way FreeCodeCamp does it, by the way, in case anybody's curious, we don't hire a lot of people because we don't have a big budget. We're a charity, and we're supported by many of the people listening to this. Quick plug for supporting FreeCodeCamp. FreeCodeCamp is made possible by around 9,000 people around the world who donate each month, whether that's $5, whether that's $500, and that supports our mission and helps us keep going. And these are tax-deductible donations that you can make to our charity, and that'll go directly toward paying teachers, paying for servers, things like that. So, but the way we hire is we just basically use open source as our pipeline, and people who are active contributors on open source, they're already doing the work that they would do if they join. So we can and then we meet with them, we collaborate. Like if they're good, if they're kind, and if they're thoughtful in pull requests, in GitHub issues, in forum posts, in hanging out in Discord and places like that, like they're probably pretty chill all the other time too. So that's like the biggest way that we identify talent is just people that are prolific contributors. And if you look at our team, I think everybody, like maybe 1 or 2 people weren't prolific contributors before they joined the team. So it's kind of similar. Like if we had the ability to like pay people bounties for like doing pull requests or something like that, we would do that. And that would probably meet the other criteria, right? That you said about paying people, but they're doing very relevant work and they have a choice of what work they want to do and how they want to approach it, how they want to contribute. So that's super cool. I want to talk a little bit about behavioral interviews because I've never gone through one that I knew of. I mean, maybe I went through some interview where they were actually like, is Quincy a reasonable culture fit for our organization? Maybe they were deciding that while I was on the whiteboard or something. But what is a behavioral interview? And like, maybe you could talk about like, do you actually hire people like as a manager, or do you just take people that have already been hired and managed?
No, I did hire not a full-time position, but a summer intern. And I tell you, I looked at every single application individually that came through. I didn't just like weed people out. I read every single one. There were like 1,000 of them. And then I went through the interview process. I think we started with maybe 15 that I met with. And then we got it down to 1 from there. But what was your original question?
Oh, behavioral interviews. Yeah. How do you like determine if someone's a good fit? Yeah.
So this is where it gets tricky because you don't want to just hire the same type of person over and over again. Actually having diversity, difference of where, culture and how you think through problems. These things have shown, studies have shown that more diverse teams are more successful in the long term because you are challenging each other and coming up with new solutions to solve problems. So I just want to say that up front, like you're not looking for people who will necessarily like fit the status quo of what you already have. You're looking for people who will broaden your perspective, right? So cultural interviews are specifically around how you handle adversity or challenges or how you work. So common questions might be, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a colleague and how did you work through that? It might be, tell me about what are your strengths and weaknesses? It might be, tell me about a time that you managed a project that failed. How did you handle that and why did it fail? What did you learn from that? So it's about I don't want to say non-technical aspects to the job, but it's about how you communicate, how you deal with challenges, how you deal with conflict at work.
Yeah. And have you ever had someone like fail behavioral tests in like a spectacular fashion or anything like that? Or is it usually more subtle? Like you just subtly pick up on like passive aggressiveness or like inflexibility to like feedback or something like that?
It wasn't a cultural interview. It was actually a technical interview that I stopped them in the process because of a cultural disagreement, which was not cultural disagreement. I don't want to say it that way, but it was that they were condescending towards me. So I was the lead interviewer. There was a man in the room who was my co-interviewer, and the person interviewing was he was struggling with a challenge at the time with CSS, and I was trying to help him through. We were trying to diagnose. I mean, I knew what was going wrong, but I didn't want to give him the answer. So I was like, hey, why don't we look this up on Mozilla? Something to that extent. And he cut me off mid-sentence and said, I don't think this is that important. I know we've got other stuff to cover. I think we should move on. And I was like, yes, we can move on. But that shows me if you're putting your best foot forward in an interview and you are not willing to collaborate effectively, that to me says that you're not interested in having a healthy working relationship or pair programming relationship with the people around you. So,
yeah. So you could kind of tell right away, like, this person's not going to be any fun to work with, or this person's going to potentially be too stubborn and introduce problematic code or something like that. Or do you think I mean, if you don't mind me asking, like, how much of it do you think it was a male interviewee and you had another male colleague?
Yeah.
And maybe you've experienced where they're like looking over at that person, even though they're supposed to be looking at you.
Right. Yeah. It could be one of those situations as well, which frankly, I understand that some people are uncomfortable in certain situations, and I try not to hold things like that against someone. But if it's a repeated pattern of behavior, which in this case it was, he had done, other stuff throughout the interview. It was kind of like, okay, I've seen a pattern of behavior at this point. I will say, so I used to do interviews for the college that I went to. I was interviewing applicants, and that interview would kind of determine whether or not they were accepted into the college. And it was a behavioral interview. And I asked them, have you ever wanted to study abroad? Just, I was making conversation. That answer really, he could have said yes or no. It wouldn't have made a difference. But it's just about how you present your views on things. And he looked at me and he said, I have no desire to learn about other cultures. I don't care about other cultures. And to me, like, that's an example of a response to a cultural interview behavior question that may turn off an interviewer. Sorry. At that point, what we're looking for is a growth mindset. Are you able to acknowledge your not deficits, but your shortcomings, the areas of improvement? Are you willing to take responsibility for things that maybe didn't go right? Are you able to not blame other people for mistakes, right? Like, if you have a conflict with a team member, I don't want to hear you say that they're a horrible person and you should never work with them, right? I want to hear that you take responsibility for your actions, you both had a healthy conversation, and you came to a resolution. So it's all about how you portray these thoughts. I tell my husband all the time, it's not what you say, it's how you say it in most cases, right? So, practice your answers to these questions, right? You don't have to agree with everything that's happened throughout your career or whatnot, but it's really about how you're communicating these things.
Yeah. That's an interesting observation, that it's not really about what you're saying, but how you say it. Like, are you polite? Are you thoughtful?
Yeah.
Are you able to kind of tactfully understand that it might sound kind of closed-minded and, anti-intellectual to say, I'm just not interested in other cultures, right? Like, do you have self-awareness?
Yeah. Right. And to be also honest, I understand that I'm speaking my native language, and the people I interview are not always speaking their first language. So I try to take things with a grain of salt. But for example, if I'm like, oh, why are you interested in leaving your current role at your company? And they start talking about how they hate leadership and they hate their team members and they think it's a terrible product. Okay, maybe we don't want to trash talk our previous. Did I love every company that I worked for in the past? I didn't love everything about them, right? But you're never going to hear me say it that way in an interview. Like, oh, I hate this so much. I would never trash talk, anyone I worked with or for or a company I worked at, right? So again, it's all about how you communicate these things.
Yeah. There's that old saying: if you don't have something to say that's nice, don't say anything at all. And that is a very self-serving kind of like heuristic that I mean, obviously you need to pipe up. If you believe strongly enough about something, you should object to things and you should call things out. But if it's not like a big deal, don't like make yourself known as the kind of person who trash talks a former employer or trash talks colleagues or things like that. Like it's probably not going to serve you well to do so. I'm really interested now. So talk about your career progression, because you are somebody who's gone from intern to developer, and you may, I haven't looked at your LinkedIn very closely, but you may have gone to like senior developer or in some of these organizations. No, you were able to skip that.
Nope.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting because to be an engineering manager 1, which is where I started out at, you technically are supposed to be a senior engineer prior to moving into that because they're lateral. And you're supposed to, quote unquote, it's, somewhat expected that within a year or so, you would move on to engineering manager 2. So it's a transitory role. I always thought I'd be senior. This was kind of my biggest holdback with jumping immediately into interviewing for management was, first of all, I always thought I'd be in my 40s. I don't know why that I would think I'd be more proficient at this job when in my 40s, but that was a preconceived notion. And also, I thought I'd be a senior engineer first. But because you have to remember, every time you switch companies, it can either be a promotion or it can hold you back in terms of how quickly you grow at a company, right? So I would always switch companies after like 2 years. I did this twice, or teams within the company. And then, of course, you're kind of starting a little bit lower on the level. Like, it takes you longer then to reach senior.
Yeah.
And frankly, I probably wouldn't have gotten a senior within the next 2 years anyway. Like I said, I just wasn't interested, so I wasn't doing the best job. But no, I never was a senior. I just went straight from, engineering to engineer to, was it engineer 2? Yeah, engineer 2 directly into management.
Okay. Yeah. So even though the one thing that you mentioned that I think is really interesting is people have this like perception that like, as I get older, I'm going to naturally get promoted. And that may be how it works in some companies and some cultures, but that generally isn't how it works in software development, right? As a field, like generally you have to prove yourself and take on more responsibility and be proactive if you want to get promoted or if you want to make moves within an organization. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, it takes work. Also, we're seeing a shift in the industry to become flatter overall. So we're eliminating a lot of the vertical positions that previously enabled you to move up the chain very quickly. So what this means is you're going to have to set your expectations. You're not going to achieve the next level within, a handful of years, if ever. Like, not as many people are going to become a staff engineer as previously in the past years were, because we're flattening the hierarchy. And that being said, I do think that there is an emphasis on like this hustle culture, like, I became a senior 2 years into software engineering. And it's like, if that is your case, I'm super happy for you. But we also need to remember that a senior at company A does not equate to senior at company B. It very much depends, right? So an engineer 2 at Spotify does not correlate with an engineer 2 at Netflix. We have very different band levels and job titles. So I think there's this hustle culture emphasis on like getting promoted. You have to do it quickly. But then it begs the question, why? Why do you want to be promoted? Is it a higher title that you feel that you need more authority on paper in order to be taken seriously in your company? That's could be a real issue. Is it that you want more money, so you need to be in a higher band? Is it that you're bored and you just have these expectations on yourself that you should be getting promoted every 2 years, right? So I think asking why is really, really important. Because if you're just looking for new challenges, hopefully you're enabled to do that in your current role.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight. And let's talk a little bit about like hustle culture and kind of what people are seeing when they open up like TikTok or they're on YouTube and like, the sky is falling, tech is over, or like in order to get a job, you've got to be like so much better than you used to be, or even like this kind of like resignation that people might feel like the window for getting into tech has closed, and now there are like so many senior engineers that are like super experienced that are all struggling to get a job and stuff like that. Like, there's a lot of miscommunication out there, and there's a lot of oversimplification, and there are frankly a lot of people out there just trying to get people to click and watch their video so they can get like AdSense money and things like that, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions you think people might have if they were to open up TikTok and search computer science or software engineer job or something like that. I don't know if you spend any time on TikTok.
I spent all my time on TikTok. It's so tricky because a lot of the videos I see are like, come to work with me at my 9 to 5, at Google in Silicon Valley or, these big name companies, I think there is a misconception that you are not as valued if you're not working at a FANG company. This was a misconception that not that I had, but I had just accepted an offer at IBM, and I got a message from this kid at my college. It was like, well, it's not FANG, so it's not that good. And I'm like, why do you have that misconception? So you're seeing a lot of like the FANG software engineers. If you don't know what FANG is, it's like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix. I don't know what they all are anymore. They're all renamed anyway. Yeah. Right. So there's this misconception.
They changed their name every few years just to keep it spicy and dodge bad publicity.
Exactly. There's a misconception that maybe all tech jobs are like that, all tech companies are like that, and so people get into the industry with these ideas of what every tech company must be like, and that's probably also not the case. There's also like, if I'm not working at one of these companies, these big giants in tech, I'm not as worthy of the title, or I'm not as important or valued or whatever, which is also total BS. And I wish that we would normalize like more accessible and attainable like companies. The majority are not these massive conglomerates. The majority are most likely mid-sized companies or even smaller companies that don't maybe have a cafeteria with free food and massive corporate offsites, right? So there's that side. Then there's the other side that's like, I became a staff engineer, a senior engineer after 1 year of coding, which can happen. Absolutely. It really, if you put in some work and you're given an opportunity, I think it can happen. But that's for like the 0.1%. We need to be realistic that like there were other factors into this, right? I'll be honest, I wouldn't be where I am today without, the privilege of where I grew up, having the parents with the connections I had. Yes, I put work in, but all of these factors, gave me a leg up in a lot of respects, right? Many of these people that got promoted within a year to senior, same thing, right? They had circumstances that helped them. It's not that they didn't put work in, but I think we fail a lot of times to recognize that. So I think those are the two biggest ones.
Okay, so and the two biggest ones, just like thinking that like if you're not, it's like Google or bust, basically. Like you've somehow failed if you're not working in a FANG company, and not understanding that like there are lots of great employers and lots of prestigious jobs that aren't necessarily working for these brand name consumer companies. The second observation being that yes, you can have rapid career progression, but a lot of times that's based on luck or maybe superhuman talent. You're just exceptionally talented, or you're exceptionally good at building rapport with your managers and reassuring them that you're ready to take on more responsibility, which is probably a huge dimension at companies like that have like a more hierarchy and stuff, like being able to navigate that. So those being the two things, like people are too focused on getting specific jobs to the neglect of like all these other great opportunities out there, and that they misunderstand how quickly things can happen, and they probably also misunderstand the role of privilege. And that's something we talk a lot about on the podcast. I am a guy who grew up at like a specific time and was able to go to college inexpensively without a lot of debt. I didn't grow up in like a really cool city. I grew up in like Oklahoma City, which not Oklahoma City, but it's not like a tech mecca. And I went to like a cheap state school, but I could do all that stuff. And I had middle-class parents who were educated and saw value in like getting a computer early on, so that I had access to, me and my siblings had a computer that we could experiment with, like all this stuff, right? Like I grew up speaking English. I'm white, like all these different things helped me a great deal. And I feel like a lot of people dismiss that. No, it's because I'm late. No, it's because I'm like, I hustled, And they kind of like downplay the role of all these other luck factors. I definitely feel like I've been incredibly lucky, not just on those kinds of things, but I rolled on like being in the right place at the right time, career-wise, and things like that too. So, and that frankly doesn't get communicated in like a 2-minute video. Like, here's my, T-bar. Like I went to Google in New York City and they had this massive T-bar, and I'm like a huge tea enthusiast. Yeah. And they had like, I'm not kidding, they had like 40 different variations of like tea. Yeah. That you could choose. And they had this really like these nice cups with this hot water on demand and all this stuff. And I was like, whoa, this is perfect. I wish I had this. I know. And I'm sure Spotify has some amenities, maybe not as lush.
Oh yeah. They they really do treat us to things that I'm very grateful for. I'll say, like, we have a barista bar up on the 12th floor that overlooks the old city and stock. It's beautiful, right? And they take care of us, right? But this is also, it's not standard in the industry. But I will say 2 things can be true at once. And this is something I'm grappling with now at 30 years old. 2 things can be true at once. You could have hustled your butt off to get to where you are, studied, stayed up all night, sent in hundreds of applications to get where you are today, right? But also, you could have been in a position of privilege that gave you tools that others might not have had. And I don't think there's any shame in that, right? What I'm trying to do now is acknowledge where I've come from and how that's given me a leg up, and also give it back to the community to some extent, which I was better at in my younger days by putting out free content and, helping by hiring people who might, even interviewing people who might not have had a chance, right? But I think we need to, as a community, get better at acknowledging this can be true, and also I might have had a leg up in certain areas as well.
Yeah. And when I always say, like, your mileage may vary. Like, don't expect to have, like, necessarily, like, the fortune in starting an open source project that picks up so much steam and has people like Emma Bostian using it to, like, learn to code and things like that. Like, that was a series of, like, very specific events that were probably cosmically improbable, and I feel like often just incredibly fortunate to be involved with this project, right? And I meet lots of people like that are kind of like outliers, and I think the main kind of thing that they have, like, the epistemological humility, right? They understand that the people that they're talking to when they go to a big conference, all those ambitious people who want to get things done, who want to learn from, like, Steve Wozniak or somebody like that, right? That's always on the speaker tournament, is like, everybody's circumstances are different. Everybody's, the advice they give, the mileage is going to vary, right? So yeah, I definitely applaud you for doing that. I do want to talk a little bit more about working at different companies, because you've worked at a lot of them. Are there any telltale signs of a company that you don't want to work for? Like, is there any, like, kind of like acid test, like when you walk in, or like something that immediately says, I need to get out of here. I'm squandering my time.
One immediate thought was, if they tell you that they're a family, that might not be the best indicator that they have your best interest at heart. I'm just thinking, like, especially in the US, you can hire and fire so quickly. And often companies will preach, we're a family, we do everything for each other. But, when budgets come in and they don't have the money, you're the first to go, right? And where's the family connection then? So if someone markets their company as a family, you can have a very strong culture, don't get me wrong, but marketing it as a family is inappropriate. And that is one thing that I would steer away from. The second would be how they treat you during the interview process, I guess. I had an interview. I was already working at IBM full time. This was at the point about the year mark where I was looking for other internal roles because I was not happy with enterprise storage. And I interviewed for a different team, and I walk into the room. It's supposed to be a front-end interview for a front-end job. And I stood in front of a whiteboard with 5 men sitting in chairs watching me, and they were asking me Java questions. And I was like, I didn't prepare for this. This is a front-end role. It's supposed to be a front-end interview. And I said this to them. I said, I didn't prepare Java. Well, it's on your resume from when you were back in college. Yeah, because I worked on it in college like 4 years ago, of course. That to me was like almost a turning point of like, okay, if I had started, if I hadn't already been internal at IBM and I had that experience, I would have said absolutely not. I was already internal, so it didn't make a difference. But yeah, it's really, how do they treat you during the process? Do they treat themselves very egotistically, like, oh, we already work here, like, we know you want this job, it's the best company ever, I'm better than you? If that's the vibe that you're getting, I would say it's only going to get worse once you're there. So look for people who, some of my colleagues that I manage have been at the company for over 10 years, and I'm not kidding, they still will ask for help from the people who've only been here a year. There's no ego involved anywhere. that's the type of company I do want to work for. So whenever there's ego or this whole we're a family thing, those are two big indicators I don't want to work for you.
Yeah, that's a great acid test, if you will. Like how people carry themselves, whether they treat it like the interview is kind of like a fraternity initiation or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things you said is like you have colleagues who are you're kind of coaching them. You're helping the people that you manage. One of the things that I've seen through a lot of your work is a focus on mentorship and a focus on helping build up other people. Can you talk a little bit about how you help people make advancements, like things you've done over the past few years and things you've learned along the way about helping people have more fruitful careers?
Sure. So I think the biggest revelation I had about mentorship is when you think of mentorship, you're likely thinking of two people talking either in a room, on Zoom, etc., where one person, the mentee, is asking questions of the mentor who likely has more expertise in a specific area, and it's very synchronous. What I've come to realize is that there's a secondary type of mentorship that frankly could be more impactful, and that's asynchronous mentorship through blogging, through making courses, things that will live in the ecosystem that can impact thousands or millions of people, right? That's what you're doing with freeCodeCamp. You're giving people a free resource, and that's mentorship at a very large scale. So back in the day when I was a young kid, it's probably, oh my gosh, a long time ago, I created this open source project called Coding Coach, where the whole mantra was to connect mentors with mentees all over the world for free, right? Oftentimes mentors were found within your company, but what happens if you don't have a company to find a mentor in? That can be really tricky. So we created that. It was doing really well. I'm not sure what the state is because, I got bored of the project and moved on to other stuff. Are we surprised? But it was a really nice community of people who just wanted to give back. And I very much appreciate everyone's time there. The stipulation I have with mentorship now is that as a mentee, so you are someone who has identified another person that you want to learn from. It is your responsibility to set the cadence, to set the agenda, to have things to discuss if you're asking from time from someone else. And oftentimes what I see is people will say, hey, will you be my mentor? I've done that in the past. I'm guilty of that. But
very low effort.
Yeah, you're putting the burden on the other person for no return on their investment almost, right? So if you want to be mentored by someone, first of all, ask them. What do you have to lose by asking someone to be your mentor? Nothing, right? You only have something to gain from it. However, if you're going to ask someone to be your mentor, have a set of skills tangible skills. Have a plan. Say, hey, Quincy, I'm really hoping that you'll be my mentor. I would love to expand my skills in JavaScript, specifically with data structures and algorithms. I'm hoping that we can meet once a month on meeting for 30 minutes. And at the end of the meeting, we come up with a new challenge for me to work on over the course of the next month, right? And I'm looking for mentorship for the next, 5 months. So 5 sessions in total. Are you able to do that with me? Come with a specific plan, because that's giving the mentor you're asking time from all the information they need to make a decision.
Yeah.
It can be very uncomfortable when someone approaches you like, hey, will you be my mentor? Because, of course I want to say yes to you. And as someone who historically overcommits to everything for fear of saying no to someone, I've done that before. I said yes, and then there was no plan, and it became very stressful and awkward, right? So come with a plan if you're going to ask someone to be your mentor. I find that to be the best way to do it. There are different types of mentorships. They could be career-related. It could be just someone to bounce ideas off of in terms of, how did I handle the situation? Was I overreacting? How could I have communicated better? It could be technical mentor, etc. Don't have to be in your company. They could be at a different company. Just maybe don't share proprietary information. So do your research, figure out what type of mentorship you're looking for. Come with a list of things that you're looking for help with. What type of cadence are you looking for? And, worst case, they say no, and that's okay. You can move on to find someone else. Best case, they say yes, and you've got a mentor. Yeah,
that's great. That's great advice. So having a clear timeline of when, how long this mentorship is going to last, because people, I'm allergic to, recurring, unending meetings. For example, like people often ask me, this is going to sound like a humble brag. People ask me to be on their board or something like that, right? But I always say no because I'm like, I don't want some recurring like, meeting on the books for years. What am I agreeing to, you know? So like by being very specific, like we're going to meet 5 times over the course of 5 months, we're going to do X, Y, Z. Like, I think that's great. And so that is a gold nugget for anybody out there who's looking to get help from a specific person, like maybe somebody that works at your company, maybe that works at somebody you meet at a tech meetup around your city or something. You're like, man, I could learn so much from this person. You know, come to them with a clear plan for how they're going to help you, and don't put it on them.
Yeah.
I just have a couple more very quick questions because I want to be mindful of your time. One is, let's talk about the Ladybug podcast. I just want to shout this out. It's not active right now. You mentioned that you might bring it back at some point, but if you are interested in getting into tech, there's this massive corpus of knowledge from you, from a lot of other people. I think Kelly Bond, like people that are, if they haven't been on the freeCodeCamp podcast, they probably will be on the freeCodeCamp podcast in the near future. And it's just like, I don't know, tens of hours of you all talking about different topics. Maybe you can talk about the Ladybug podcast and, you know, the reason you created it and some of your favorite topics that you've covered over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Our goal was really just to share knowledge, being that Kelly had really great experience creating and running a business. And Allie was doing a lot of like developer relations work, and Sydney was working as an engineer. She had moved states and started a new role, more on the, you know, not beginner side, but like she'd only been doing it a couple of years, where Kelly had maybe like 10 years experience, for example. And I was working for mid-level companies like all over the world. Okay, between Europe and the US.
Yeah.
So we had different experiences, and we also brought on some guests from all over to talk about different topics like GraphQL and what are some of the others we talked about? Probably like different design systems and CSS. Some of my favorite topics, though, honestly, I thrive talking about concepts as opposed to like deep technical things. It's also really hard to describe like data structures and algorithms through voice. Imagine trying to describe like, you know, merge sort just through spoken word. It's not the easiest. So those were maybe not my favorite, but the ones about career development and cross-cultural communication, engineering leadership, those types of topics were probably my favorites.
Awesome. So I'm going to link to that in the show notes. I encourage people who want to learn more from that. Again, that's a massive corpus of wisdom coming straight from you, Kelly, Allie, Sydney. And yeah, there's been so many amazing guests over the years, and I really enjoyed listening to that. As a man in tech, it gave me like women in tech perspective. And that's something I value a great deal because, as you said earlier, like people should be proactively seeking out other viewpoints and understanding more about the world around them. And that's very important to me. Like it's very important to me that we get more women into tech and that we have, you know, better representation. We get representation back to what it used to be like in terms of just having a lot more women in tech. And like freeCodeCamp, like we put our proverbial money where our mouth is, and our staff is like nearly half women. And so it's just such a cool thing to be able to listen to you for talking very candidly about these topics. And it's clear like there's this level of like informality and comfort with one another. It's clear that you all have built up these relationships with one another over the years. So yeah, great podcast. I do hope you'll bring it back at some point. And yeah, is there anything else that we should talk about before we let you get back to your husband and your daughter?
I want to know what your favorite part of your job is.
It has to be talking to people like you. Like,
oh, okay. Tell me something less flattering.
No, I'm serious. Like I learned a great deal. Like I'm not going to share my screen, but I've got like Sublime Text open. I have 219 lines of text, each line being a paragraph. Like that I just type the entire time. Basically, you're talking. I'm like writing this down so I can review it. I'm going to listen to this podcast when I walk my kids. Like after I drop my kids off at school, I'm going to listen to it while I go for a walk. later on. And like, I cherish this opportunity to talk with somebody like you who's in the field, who's working at a big tech company like Spotify, who's worked at IBM, who has, had the experiences you've had. Like, it's so amazing. And I've talked with lots of other great, engineers, thinkers on the FreeCodeCamp podcast. And I love podcasts as a medium. Like, I genuinely believe, I was talking with Ken G the other day. He's a data science creator and has some courses and things like that. He runs the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. And I told him, I genuinely think that if podcasts were around as a kid, I would be like 10 times more interesting and 10 times smarter than I am today, because I'm learning so much from them. And I do not take for granted at all that there are people like you that sit down and record their thoughts and share them with the world in this, open protocol, or is this, like where anybody can access it and listen to it, and it's free. And I listen to a lot of podcasts from other parts of the world. There's like this great security focused podcast called like Risky Business, like the 1980s Tom Cruise movie. I think it's like Aussies, Australians that do that. And then I even listen to podcasts in other languages just to improve my listening comprehension, things like that. It's amazing. So that would be like my number one favorite thing. But my number two favorite thing is working with like such a cool international team. We've got like more than 21 countries represented among the 35 or so people on the FreeCodeCamp team, and getting to like learn more about their cultures. Because like you, I spent like 6 years abroad, like living in China, and just learning the culture, and my wife's Chinese. And so like, having conversations with her relatives in Cantonese, and then being able to go and we're going to take the kids to Beijing this summer and go check out the Summer Palace and stuff like that. Being able to share that like long, 5,000 year cultural history with my kids, things like that. And this is like a job where I get to like meet with people. Like, I met with a bunch of people from Japan the other day. I'm meeting people in Korea. And of course we have like we just published a big Spanish course yesterday on TypeScript. It's in Spanish, taught by native Spanish speakers. And same, like a lot of Brazilians in the FreeCodeCamp curriculum community. So like that international aspect for me is like a dream, because when I was a kid, like I just knew I wanted to, whatever I did, I wanted it to have like a cool international focus, where like I was not just talking with, people from my own culture, but like constantly being challenged. And, if you've always lived in your country and you haven't really spent a lot of time outside of your country, you just take so much for granted. It's like this extra layer of difficulty, but it's just this extra layer of fun and all these cool, quirky, like interplay of cultural, anyway, I could talk about this all day. I don't want to be respectful of your time and of our listeners' time, but I'm very passionate about like, like my dream was to be a diplomat, and I was going to take like the civil service or the foreign service exam and do all this stuff. I'm glad I didn't go into that, because I wouldn't want to work under like this big bureaucracy and doing all this crazy stuff that they do. But like, this is, I feel like I'm almost kind of like a cultural ambassador for like the U.S. tech scene, and being able to like introduce people to you and like, show that like the U.S. is actually has like kind, thoughtful people as well. It's not just like selfish people. Like it's so fun and interesting. So that like the talking to people like you, and then talking to people on my team, talking to our many open source contributors. I talked to somebody from Pakistan the other day. We have team members in Pakistan, but it was just cool. Like, he barely spoke any English, but he's a prolific contributor on the forum. He's very good with written English. He's just not as good with verbal English, and being able to learn from him. So learning, I'm all about learning. Like, I always want to be like leveling up some aspect of my personality, whether it's like language skills, whether it's getting better at bass, or whether it's getting better at interviewing people and asking relevant, thoughtful questions and seeing out insights that, man, I never thought about that before. When somebody said, "Oh, that's a good question," I'm like, "Oh," Yeah. So anyway, it's just been such a pleasure talking with you, Emma. I'm going to encourage everybody to check out the Ladybug podcast. I'm going to encourage them to follow you on Twitter. Is there anything else I should encourage them to do?
No, just take care of yourselves. I feel like life is chaotic for lots of people at the moment.
Yeah. Take care of yourself. 100%.
Thanks for having me, Quincy. It was super nice to chat with you.
Likewise. Well, everybody, until next week, happy coding.